Welcome, everyone. Gary Lachman is our guest tonight. Gary is the author of many books about consciousness, culture, and the Western esoteric tradition, including The Return of Holy Russia, Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump, and Lost Knowledge of the Imagination and Beyond the Robot, the Life and Work of Colin Wilson. He writes for several journals in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and Europe, and he lectures around the world, and his work has been translated into more than a dozen languages. In a former life, he was a founding member of the pop group Blondie, and in 2006 was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Before moving to London in 1996 and becoming a full-time writer, Lachman studied philosophy, managed a metaphysical bookshop. He taught English literature and was a science writer for UCLA. He is an adjunct professor of transformative studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he can be reached, and I'll give this information, and we can put it in the link down below, at garylachman.co.uk and facebook.com/GVLachman and Twitter. He's on Twitter as well, at Gary Lachman. We're going to begin the video with a video that Gary has chosen, and I will share that screen now. Here we go.
Are you an outsider? On the whole, I'd say no. I don't think it's a particularly good thing to be an outsider. I consider the outsider a sign of a civilization in decay. These rebels would once upon a time have been, I don't know, maybe saints, maybe men of genius, but now they have nothing to do except rebel. When we read about the psychopathic criminal, we learn that he's normally the insignificant little man. The man who bursts out into periodic violence is a man who normally lives his life on a general level of insignificance. I feel the outsider is an attempt of society to move back towards health, towards the healthy attitude that will prevent all this.
In the spring of 1956, a book appeared on the London literary scene that took it by storm. Prestigious critics like Cyril Connolly and Philip Toynbee tripped over themselves to sing its praises, as well as that of its precocious author, a 24-year-old working-class lad from Leicester, with no university education who, nevertheless, as one critic declared, walked into literature as a man walks into his own house. The book was truly an overnight success. It made its author a household name, established him as one of the most important figures in modern literature, and threw him from bohemian obscurity into a very public spotlight. The book was The Outsider, a study in alienation and extreme mental states, and its author was Colin Wilson, who was soon dubbed England's own homegrown existentialist. On the day The Outsider was published, he woke up to find his name in all the papers, with all of England resounding his acclaim. It was a celebrity that would soon reach Europe and across the Atlantic. Wilson was soon caught up in the heady publicity surrounding The Angry Young Men, a tag given to the new crop of writers to emerge in the lingering post-war years. For months, the press couldn't get enough of the shocking antics and often scandalous adventures of Wilson, John Osborne, Kingsley Amis, Doris Lessing, and the other young angries who found themselves plastered across the News of the World, Daily Mail, and other popular papers. For a brief turbulent time, Wilson found himself as famous as Elvis Presley, James Dean, and Marilyn Monroe, whom he would in fact soon meet. But fame is fickle, especially in England, and when the press tired of the angries, they turned against Wilson. After the heady early days of The Outsider, Wilson found himself persona non grata among the critics, and his second book, Religion and the Rebel, a sequel to The Outsider, was savaged. By this time, Wilson had escaped the London scene, retreating to Cornwall in the far west of England, with his soon-to-be second wife, Joy. Their departure hastened by Joy's father's attempt to horsewhip the young existentialist for seducing his daughter, a story that filled the scandal sheets for weeks. Ignoring the critics and his publisher, who suggested he take a break from writing, Wilson hunkered down and created what he called a new existentialism, a positive creative alternative to the depressing pessimism of Sartre and co. Throughout the 1960s, his early fame now turned to notoriety. Wilson spent much time in America lecturing, developing his ideas and completing what he called the outsider's cycle, an analysis of modern consciousness that set the foundation for his life's work. Wilson's comeback came in 1971 when his book The Occult became a bestseller, echoing the early success of The Outsider and reaching beyond it. Initially a skeptic, Wilson admits he took the commission because he needed the money. Wilson was soon convinced that the evidence for the reality of magic, the paranormal, mysticism, and altered states of consciousness was overwhelming. By the 1990s and 2000s, Wilson had embarked on another related exploration into the evidence for lost advanced civilizations. In pursuit of this, Wilson traveled around the world. His work brought him to the startling conclusion that a global maritime civilization existed for centuries during what we consider the prehistoric age. Wilson died in 2013 at the age of 82. He was the author of well over 100 books, several of which were bestsellers. He anticipated much about 21st century culture, from our interest in consciousness and ancient civilizations, to our obsession with serial killers and the forensic science that aims to catch them. He produced dozens of novels in a wide range of genre: crime, science fiction, occult, fantasy, even erotica, as well as biographies of some of the most famous figures on the alternative scene: Aleister Crowley, Wilhelm Reich, C.G. Jung, Rudolf Steiner, to name a few. Yet with all this, Wilson still remains a kind of pariah, a true outsider who was never able to shed the bad reputation he undeservedly gained in the scandalous days of the Angry Young Men. A comprehensive documentary about his life is yet to be made. There are interviews and clips from talks, but as yet no full-scale effort to tell his story on film has been attempted, until now. 7 years after his death, the need for a Wilson documentary is increasingly apparent. We are seeking support from Wilsonians the world over to contribute what you can to help fund this project. The plan is to make a comprehensive two-part history of Wilson's life, from his early days as a disaffected teenager to the success of The Outsider and Wilson's unexpected celebrity, to his later career as a leading philosopher of consciousness and his last days as a grand old man of English letters. Wilson's family, people who knew him, and people deeply influenced by his work will contribute to tell the story of the original outsider.
Really quick, Garrett, I wanted to say this is sponsored by the Blavatsky Trust, and of course your host, the Theosophical Society headquarters out of London, England. And if you have questions, folks, we will have time for questions for Gary at the end. Please drop something in the chat and I will go to you in order. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, please welcome Gary Lachman.
And everyone in between. Yes, thank you very much. Just to let you know that video we just watched, it's sorry to start with a commercial in a way, but it's a demo for a project to get a full-on, full-scale Colin Wilson documentary shot. And the people doing it, they're going to set up a page, Patreon page and all that kind of thing. So I'll on my website and I'll tweet about it and all that kind of thing once it gets going. But the reason I showed it now, as well as passing on the word about the, possibly getting funding for it, is also gives you some background, sort of covers most of the stuff that I talked about in the first talk. So you're kind of coming into, we kind of truncated it, and we've had a COVID crisis in between, but we've surmounted that, and here we are through the miracle of the internet. And let me see if I can share my screen, and I will carry on more or less from where we left it off last episode. Okay, great. So the title of my book, Beyond the Robot, comes from an essay that Wilson wrote around about the same time that he got the commission to write this big second book of his, The Occult. And just to start again where we left it off last time, describe exactly what he means by the robot. And I say here it's an evolutionary labor-saving device that does its job too well. And one of the simplest ways to just describe what the robot is, and in different traditions and different kind of ways of approaching this problem in human consciousness, it has different names, but the way Wilson describes it, I find very handy and very easy to kind of understand, is if you think about whenever you wanted to learn some skill or acquire some kind of expertise at something, riding a bicycle, something as simple as that, tying your shoes, or learning how to type or something like that, or learning a foreign language. When you first start out, you have to put an enormous amount of attention into it. You have to really be there all the time, making the effort doing it. And at some point along the line, if you stick to it, something miraculous happens and suddenly you can do it. And you no longer have to pay attention. You don't have to make sure you're putting your finger on the right key all the time, or on the right, fret on the guitar, or you don't have to look in your head to try and find the English equivalent of the French, or the French equivalent of the the English you want to say. And somehow some part of you has learned it. That's the phenomenon of learning something. You've passed it on from this laborious, exhausting effort you have to make all the time onto some other part of you. And that part that does that, Wilson dubbed the robot. And it's a very handy thing to have. It's a labor-saving device, because once we learn how to ride the bike, how to type, how to speak French, then we can think about where we want to go on the bike, or what we want to say when we type, or what we want to say when we're speaking French, or whatever. That part that was absorbed in just learning how to do it is freed up to do this now, to a higher level, a more complex operation there. And that's great. This is how we manage to go on and learn things. But one of the problems is that the robot is a very efficient servant, and he's happy to do everything for us. And we more or less have slipped into a condition in which we've allowed that to happen. And this isn't a moral kind of question. We don't even know that that's happened to us. We discover this if we observe ourselves. So it's not that we're bad people for letting it happen. It's just something that's part of human nature, or human being, or human psychology that's happened. But we become aware that we live automatically in many ways. And the problem is that the robot does things for us we'd rather do ourselves. We'd rather listen to the music ourselves. We'd rather look at the sunset ourselves. We'd rather enjoy this meal ourselves. But we oftentimes go through these things only automatically. But every now and then, for some reason, that's not the case. The robot kind of takes a break. And we are aware of the question that T.S. Eliot, the fellow in the middle there, asked, like, where is the life we have lost in living? This is from one of the choruses from The Rock. And, at a certain time, we look around and we say, well, God, is this all there is? Why am I not getting any kind of savor or any kind of satisfaction from the experience? It's because you're not living. The robot's living for you. And one of the things that Wilson learned or discovered was that one of the things that can kind of shake us out of the robot's grip is crisis, inconvenience of some kind, some kind of sudden challenge to our freedom, or a challenge to anything that we hold dear, that sadly, more times than not, we take for granted. This is what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. When we have freedom, we get bored with it. We don't know what to do with it. Once it's challenged, once it's threatened, we suddenly know what it is exactly. It becomes a concrete, 3D thing whose value is absolute and immediate to us, and we'll fight for it. But once we have it again, we tend to devalue it, and again, we fall back into the grip of the robot. And another person who explored this, and that Wilson drew on, was William James, who's down in the bottom corner there. And he wrote a very important essay called The Energies of Men, in which he explores the subject of second wind, which is this phenomenon that happens to athletes. If they're running the marathon, whatever, they feel like they can't go another step, and then they push themselves just a little bit more, and suddenly, bang, an extra petrol tank kicks in, and they suddenly get this other energy. And what they have done is more or less push themselves past the robot. They push themselves past these degrees of fatigue that we've only come to accept through habit, because we habitually let the robot do everything for us. So the whole idea for Wilson is he talks about people like Graham Greene, who got himself over these horrible bouts of boredom by playing Russian roulette. Before he put the gun to his head, he was bored to tears when he put the gun to his head and he clicked pulled the trigger and the hammer fell on an empty chamber. Suddenly the world exploded for him into this incredibly, 3D, HD, virtual reality, drippingly meaningful thing. All these possibilities, but they were there all the time. Green didn't see them because he was in the grip of the robot. But the crisis, the threat, the realization of sudden annihilation was enough to do that, and it throws the robot off. And what the athlete is doing is sort of the same thing. He pushes himself. He makes a final effort that pushes past the robot's limits and throws us into this whole other tank of energy. And so, why is it not changing? Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's get past that. That's the outsider. So one of the things Wilson wanted to learn how to do, it makes perfect sense. Is there a way for throwing off the robot without putting a gun to our head? I mean, he came to this question because he realized that these characters that he talked about in the video we saw, the outsiders, these were people who had an absolute need to feel that kind of vitality of really being alive, not being in the grip of the robot. And they knew instinctively that they threw themselves into crisis, that would happen. And this is why Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, told his readers to live dangerously. Build your houses on Vesuvius, meaning like don't keep to the quiet life, because that's a kind of waking death. If you want to feel alive, you paradoxically have to confront death. And Wilson realized, yes, that works, but there's something absurd about having to put a gun to your head in order to feel like you're alive. And in any case, we build civilization in order to minimize crisis. The whole idea of civilization is to minimize the crisis in the world, to make everything work kind of smoothly so we can get on with other things. But somehow, at some point along the line, we've created this civilization where more or less crisis is minimized, but we haven't learned how to adapt our own consciousness to that. And those of us who feel the need for this kind of more intense consciousness seek out crisis, seek out inconvenience. We go live dangerously, but there's something absurd about that. It's kind of, it's at cross purposes. So is there a way to achieve the same kind of intensity of consciousness without having to put a gun to your head? And this is what he means by the challenge of no challenge. I said Wilson wrote an enormous number of books. He wrote lots of things, and I'm going to go through a number of them here, probably too many, but it's hard to cut it down to just a few. And I have these books here because this is sort of the thing he was working on before he made this sort of shift in his career, as it were, from kind of existentialist to the occult. And the first book, this was something that came out of a meeting between Wilson and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was one of the beat poets in San Francisco in North Beach. And he ran and still runs, as far as I know. I don't know if he's passed away yet. If he hasn't, he's got to be up in the hundreds by now. But City Lights Books, which is one of like the famous bookshops in San Francisco. But during the late 60s, 68, Wilson was there and he was hanging out in Haight-Ashbury. And he noticed that everyone was reading all this Eastern kind of stuff, Zen and Hinduism and Buddhism. And he felt that everyone's jumping on this kind of Eastern bandwagon, but there's a lot to be said about kind of the Western approach to consciousness, and particularly through poetry. And that was the sort of the aim of this book, was to show that, well, yes, Zen is good and all that, there's nothing wrong with it, but the same kind of thing is already happening in the West, but it appears under this other kind of form. But the kind of conclusion he comes to about consciousness is there is something he calls duo consciousness. And it's this kind of state of consciousness in where we're aware of two realities at the same time. And funnily enough, one of the examples that he gives here and in other books is actually an Eastern one. It's from Ramakrishna, the Hindu guru Ramakrishna. And when he was a young boy, he was in one of the rice paddies in India. And there was a huge dark thundercloud overhead. And he saw a flock of white cranes fly across it. And the contrast between the dark, turbid thundercloud and these fleeting white images struck him. And he fell to the ground, and he was in this state of ecstasy. And ever since then, he was in this, just the name of Kali, or the Divine Mother, would send him into this kind of state of ecstasy. So he was aware of two realities at the same time, this kind of contrast between the black and white and all that. And we ourselves, Wilson says, we can experience something like that on a less dramatic level. If he talks about if you're in a, if it's raining outside and you hear the rain pattering on the roof or on your windows and all that, but you're snug in your room at home and you got the heating on and you're reading a nice book, you're aware of the rain and the cold outside, but you're also aware of the warmth and the coziness in your own room. You're participating in both of these realities. Fundamentally, it means you're not stuck in the present. You're not fixed in the present moment, which is what being stuck in robotic consciousness does to us. Robotic consciousness means we're not aware of other realities. We're only aware of what's immediately in front of us, because that's what the robot does. It's supposed to take care of stuff. It's supposed to help us manipulate through the world and just, take care of business. It's not interested in poetry. It's not interested in the contrast between the dark cloud and the flock of cranes. It's interested in reducing everything to a sameness, because that makes it easy to get through life. That makes it easy to manipulate. That makes it easy for us to maneuver through things. All these other moments are something that break us out of that utilitarian practical view. And the book in the middle there, The Mind Parasites, this was, if you don't know it, it's actually quite a remarkable science fiction novel that Wilson wrote in the mid-60s, where he takes some of the ideas of the American horror fiction writer H.P. Lovecraft and blends them with this existential analysis of consciousness that he had been involved in I talked about in the first talk and was mentioned in the video. And fundamentally, it's about being able to, through a kind of reflective praxis, understand the structures of consciousness. Because the basic mistake we make about consciousness is that we think our awareness of the world is just a passive reflection of some world that's outside. We are all mirrors or cameras. And when we look out the world, we open our eyes, we just reflect something that's out there already. But phenomenology, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means the study of your own states of consciousness, reveals to us that actually we participate already in the world that we perceive, that we think is just there when we open our eyes, on a subconscious, on a level that we're not immediately aware of or in touch with. Our mind in some way is already at work organizing the world around us, because otherwise it's what William James called the blooming, buzzing confusion. There's an enormous number of sensory data and coming from all directions all around us. And what our mind does, and we're not aware that it's doing it, but it organizes all that into what we call the world. And phenomenology is the study of where you understand, you see how that's happening. You sort of lower yourself to these levels of consciousness, kind of like a archaeological dig to this kind of basic strata where that level at which we are immediately participating with the world around us is somehow revealed to us. It's not easy, you can't learn it in a weekend, but that's the idea. And what happens in The Mind Parasites is it's science fiction. So the mind parasites are these psychic vampires that have lodged themselves in the mind of humanity. And they've been sucking away at our vitality and creativity for centuries and centuries. And what happens is that the Wilson alter ego in the book and some colleagues of him become aware of these things, and they understand that they, in a way, they're responsible for all of these figures from the 19th century, these great romantics who died young or went mad, like Nietzsche went mad, and Baudelaire died of syphilis, and Maupassant as well, and Shelley and Keats, and all these romantics, they became intuitively aware of the greater powers of the mind. They had these ecstatic states. I mean, suddenly, if you look at the great shift that happened in the late 18th, early 19th century, between this kind of very neat, tidy vision of humanity that the 18th century had, and then you had this romantic explosion with Goethe and Beethoven, and the notion that man is M doesn't just mean men, although mostly there were men doing that, but actually Mary Wollstonecraft was ahead of Coleridge and Wordsworth just by a tad. She was writing about the sublime, which is sort of the essence of romanticism. So she kind of a little bit just ahead of them, but they got most of the credit. But in any case, all of us at that point, suddenly we became aware of this kind of tremendous inner power that we weren't aware of, and all these romantics were having these ecstatic states. But what happened is they more, except for the first giants like Goethe and Blake and Beethoven, most of the ones who came after were kind of weak individuals, and they more or less were shattered by their ecstatic experiences because it only weakened them for dealing with the real world. And Wilson is saying, that's the mind parasites. So he comes up with this myth to explore what had happened. But then these people become aware of them, and they learn through phenomenology, phenomenological kind of discipline. They learn how to gain access to their own powers, and they defeat the mind parasites. So it's a good read. But the other one over here, this other novel called The Black Room, that is the one that really takes up this notion of the challenge of no challenge. Because Wilson sees that when we're up against a challenge, when we're up against something, we do well. All of our forces and powers come, we roll up our sleeves, we're going to get this done and all that kind of thing. But once that's gone, we go like that. We don't know how to keep it up ourselves, in that way. And he said, we have to take on, we have to confront, head on this whole problem, the mystery, the great mystery of human boredom. Because that's what it is. It's sort of boredom is when the mind kind of congeals. There's no challenge. There's nothing is interesting. There's nothing to throw you out of yourself. And he said, well, okay, the way to do that, we have to take, what is the most boring situation we could possibly be in, and this was The Black Room, a sensory deprivation chamber. And so Wilson is very adept at taking particular genres and using them for his philosophical purposes. So with Mind Parasites is science fiction, The Black Room is an espionage novel. And there's MI6 or whatever is bringing in these different people who they feel might be able to resist the Black Room, because they know that this is how the enemy agents are using to break them down and get all the secret information. So they want to find somebody who can resist the Black Room and see how long they could, last in it. And again, the Wilsonian alter ego hero in this novel is a musician who discovers a way, again, through this kind of phenomenological reflection of consciousness, to reach into his inner reservoirs of purpose and power, and is no longer dependent on the external world. I mean, that's the challenge. I mean, Gurdjieff knew this. Gurdjieff said, we need food, we need drink, we need air, but more than anything else, we need impressions. Because if we're cut off by impressions, we'll just completely die within seconds. And it's a bit dramatic, but that's more or less what happens in the Black Room, because they have food, they have drink. There's no real physical threat to them, but the threat comes from within, because in the Black Room, there's no escape from you. And who are you exactly? What is this thing called consciousness? And here I am. And there's nothing out there to distract you from, your own inner workings. And, you start to hallucinate, or your fears come up and all this kind of thing. And the answer to the Black Room from Wilson is to come up with a response to the challenge of no challenge, to be able to muster in yourself the response that you have to a challenge without the actual challenge. And this is an answer to the question of, can we throw off the robot without putting a gun to our head? One of the ways you can imagine putting a gun to your head. And if you imagine it quickly, vividly enough, it can have the same effect. And so this is kind of one of the leads that he takes into this next step in his career. And here we go. And this is his comeback book, The Occult. And I'm over there. And the reason I have this picture is not only because I liked looking at myself when I was 19, but also because this is when I first came across Wilson's work. I was living in New York, playing in Blondie, who nobody knew about them then at all, in 1975 on the Bowery. But in this milieu where I was living at the time, there was a lot of leftover stuff from the kind of previous 60s hippie magical occult generation. And even the occult came out in 71, so it still kind of bridges over into the 70s. But I personally had no interest in the occult when I first came across it. I had read existentialism and Nietzsche and the Beats and Hesse and all that kind of thing. But I wasn't really interested in magic in a real kind of sense. And I liked horror films and Lovecraft and weird tales sort of stuff, but I didn't take it seriously. But in this milieu I was in, the two people in the band I lived with, Chris and Debbie, they had upside down pentagrams and voodoo dolls, and it was real kitschy kind of occult kind of like through the I Ching and that kind of thing. And there was another guy in this loft we lived in who was this flamboyant gay artist, but he was really into Crowley, and he had the Crowley tarot deck and he used to do these impromptu readings. And so in that atmosphere, I became interested in it. And one of the books I came across was this one. And it literally changed my life, because after reading this book, I became, nuts about this. And, it ruined me for rock and roll after a few years. But one of the things that he talks about at the bottom, if you can see there, he talks about this thing called Faculty X. And this is something that he already sort of came upon in one of the earlier books, the Poetry and Mysticism, and a little bit before then, he's talking about the robot. And Faculty X just means it's a faculty we have, but we don't have a name for it. What he came to see it as, and I'll get on to the next slide, is this ability to be able to grasp a reality that's outside of the present moment. To grasp the reality of other times and places. But it doesn't mean it's nostalgic. It just means you're not pining away for these other times. You realize that those other times were just as real as the reality you're in now. So reality is not limited to the present. And this was a fundamental kind of basic experience for Wilson. But he believes that this is at the bottom of all of the kind of occult knowledge and all that. So in a way, when this book came out, he said in the demo that he accepted the commission because he needed the money. This was true. I mean, The Outsider was a big hit, but pretty much all of his books after that, one or two exceptions, didn't do as well. And he was hanging on all the time. And he actually, he had to spend a few years just lecturing in the States in order to make a living. And what had happened, he more or less sat the 60s out. He wasn't, The Outsider was a big book for the 60s and the Beats and those kind of, but the rest of his books weren't, because he wasn't really into the Eastern thing and he wasn't into psychedelics. So it was a different kind of thing that he was doing. But he was aware of what had happened in the 60s was this occult revival. And that's something I wrote about in my first book called Turn Off Your Mind, which is about the 1960s occult revival, and pop culture was completely going over to the occult. And that got started with the book called The Morning of the Magicians, that was published in France in the 1960s, and that became a big bestseller in Europe and then in the English and American editions as well. And suddenly publishers realized, people really interested in the occult now. So around 68, Wilson got approached by an American publisher and asked, do you want to write a book about the occult? And he said himself, he always had kind of a, interest in it, but he didn't really take it seriously. I mean, Crowley had already turned up in a couple of his books. There's an early novel of his called The Sex Diary of Gerard Sorm, where he meets this character called Caradoc Cunningham, who's actually based on Crowley, and he's a sex magician who knows all about Tantra and all that kind of stuff. And then he did a book about Rasputin, but he was interested in it, but it was kind of tongue-in-cheek. He didn't really take it seriously. But as he says in the introduction to this, when he did the research for this book, he realized that actually, the evidence for the paranormal, the occult, mystical states of consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is there. It's just as much there and evident as anything else. And he says somewhere in the book where, if the statistical evidence was being presented in reference to alpha particles or the mating habits of, albino rats, scientists wouldn't have any problem with it. But because it's about, telepathy, or it's about precognition, or it's about astral travel. And it's the same thing today. I mean, last year, I was in New York, a place called the Omega Institute, and I did a weekend seminar with Dean Radin and some other people. And Dean Radin is sort of one of the major scientific names in parapsychology today. And he did a book called Real Magic. And he's fundamentally saying, the statistical evidence for things like precognition, telepathy, a variety of other paranormal, phenomena, it's there. I said if it was anything, but it's the same. It was there 40 years ago as well. So it's a shame, it's not about the evidence. It's about, it's almost like Trump. He said, the facts don't matter. It's the attitude about the facts that matter. So it's not about the facts about parapsychology. It's all the attitude that these scientists who dismiss it have about it. But at least here in 1971, he's saying this. And what struck me about the book was that first place, it's very well written. It's a page turner. But also that he was talking, it wasn't a book about magic spells, and it wasn't a book about, pentagrams and witches. He talks about all that stuff. But it really was a book about consciousness, because he brings in all philosophers like Nietzsche and Sartre and literary figures like Goethe and Yeats and all that in the book. And I had read these people, and suddenly I realized, wow, this is really interesting. I mean, I'm 19 when I'm reading it, so I'm a naive enthusiast, and it's opening this world to me. But he made it something that was not a particular niche kind of concern, but it had to do with just the fundamental questions of human being and existence and the world and what's that like and all that. And so from there, I personally, this is how I wound up doing this now. It was from reading that book longer ago than I care to recall. But one of the basic sort of themes that he talks about in the book is the difference between solar and lunar knowledge. And to represent those two polarities, I have, those polarities, I have Albert Einstein with the sun over his head and William Butler Yeats with the moon. And we all know what solar sort of knowledge is. It's science. It's rational, reason, understanding the world. Wilson in no way wants to, negate that. And what he says is that ages ago in our past, we were closer to the animal world, closer to the natural world. And we had these sort of intuitive perception and interactions with the world. And this is what intuition is. And this is what we experience now as ESP or precognition, or a variety of other paranormal sorts of phenomena. But in order to develop the kind of rational, I don't want to say left and right brain yet, because we're going to get onto that, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. This kind of rational, sequential, logical knowledge that we can pass on to others in books and things of that sort. We had to mute that. We somehow in our evolutionary development, and again, there was nobody making us do it. We weren't whipped to do that. Now, mute your animal intuition. No, this was something that happened over millennia in our evolution, because somehow some drive in us wanted to push us out of this cozier, intuitive, unified kind of consciousness with things, which there's good evidence, because good reason to believe that animals do participate in, and when we're much younger, when we're children. But the evolutionary urge is pushing us out of that into this more daylit, logical, rational, demonstrable kind of knowledge, and which is absolutely necessary. It's enabling us to have this conversation now, or for you to listen to my monologue. But that came at a price. We had to push down. We had to somehow repress this other kind of knowledge. This knowledge, which is lunar knowledge, which is more intuitive. It's not. It doesn't cut things up into bits and pieces in order to manipulate things. It has a kind of fuzzy, total, holistic, kind of global grasp of something that it can't communicate in the precise language of science, but it can communicate in images and symbols and metaphors. And that's why Yeats is a great example of that. And this is what Wilson also says too, is that, where magic and the paranormal is rooted in this lunar knowledge, so is poetry. A poet is open to the experience of the world as this mysterious other, where the scientists, and Einstein probably isn't a good example because he wasn't the kind of, what do you want to call it, sort of imperialist sort of scientist, maybe the way we was, or colonialist kind of scientist, where we would say he doesn't really want to conquer the kind of world, but just a very good example of scientist in general. But where the kind of Francis Bacon, or the sort of science that led to technology, which again, we need it. It's not something we want to jettison, but it comes at a price. The poet and the psychic and the magician, and they're open to the world speaking to them, like drawing in the inspiration, rather than like, okay, let me take you apart in order so I can understand you. And what Wilson came to see was that, we're in a position, he felt, in terms of our evolution, where these two things were going to come together. And he would speak about this more specifically, and we'll get onto this when we get onto it, because he talked a lot about the right and left brain. But even if you look back, and I'm seeing this now, we kind of had this intuitively, that you had these two polar opposites. And the idea isn't to have one obscure the other. We don't want to go back to this earlier pre-rational, scientific view. I mean, I gave a talk at the Theosophical Society a few years ago about my book, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, and I talk about this period in history called the Axial Age, which is roughly around 500 BC, and it was this time in many ways where it seemed there was this shift from a mythic kind of poetic sort of participatory relationship to the world to the detached, rational world relationship within which we kind of separate from the world and try to understand it rationally. And we needed that, and that's what happened. And but it came at the price of repressing all this. But Wilson's seeing is that hasn't gone away. That's there. That's part of our being. And he gives many examples. And also throughout the whole book, the other reason it's a great book is he tells the stories of all these fantastic characters. Madame Blavatsky is one of them. Crowley is another. Gurdjieff. He goes back into the whole history. Pythagoras and Apollonius of Tyana, and Meister Eckhart, and so many other different characters and important figures in this whole kind of alternative history. He sort of reestablished himself as a central kind of figure in the literary and cultural world then, and became a kind of philosophical spokesperson for the paranormal. And I mentioned Faculty X, and I said the reality of other times and places, and this is a fundamental theme that he talks about in the occult and in practically all the other books that come after. And this in a way is sort of the polar opposite to the kind of robotic consciousness that keeps us fixed in the present. And if we stay in that for too long, we have this sense of like, what is there to do? I mean, life completely seems absolutely uninteresting to us because we can't see anything beyond the present moment that we're stuck in. And I have two figures there and a pack of cakes in between them. And the one on my left is the French novelist Marcel Proust. And the cake really relates to him. It's a Madeleine. And if you know his great novel, Remembrance of Things Past, this is huge, I don't know how many, 7 volumes. And it's an attempt for him to recreate his whole past life. And it all begins because he has a taste of a Madeleine, which is this little French cake, dipped in tea. And as he's tasting it, he realizes that it reminds him of something. And he can't quite grasp what it is. And then he suddenly remembers. But he doesn't just remember in some factual sense, that, oh yes, I remember, that's what it was. It all comes back to him in this kind of vivid reality. And it's when he was a little boy, his aunt used to give him a crumbled bit of the Madeleine on a teaspoon in her tisane, and he sipped it like that. And so Proust has this, and suddenly, it's not just, I said, you have to realize it's not just a memory that it happened. He's taken back to it completely. So the smells and the sights and the sounds and all of that comes back to him, and he decides that this is a way to sort of, in his own terms, escape from the robotic consciousness of being trapped in the present. And so he devotes himself to writing this novel in an attempt to kind of recreate his past. And if you know the novel, there's different famous points within it when the same kind of the kind of like the Madeleine moment happens again, and with in different contexts and all that. And but Wilson talks about that, but he also talks a great deal about the other fellow there, Arnold Toynbee, who's a great historian of the 20th century. And he had a similar experience, but it wasn't about his own life. He talks about when, in about 1912 or so, he was visiting Greece. And he was near this ruined citadel at a place called Mistra, which had been decimated like a century earlier by wild Highlanders from the north. I don't remember exactly where they came from, probably Macedonia or something like that. And they completely overran, this place. And if you know your esoteric history, Mistra is very important because Gemistos Plethon, who reintroduced Plato to the West back in 1453, came from there. But anyway, that's a side note. But at that time, it was just a complete ruin. And Toynbee had read a lot about it and read a lot about, all of history himself. And he went on to write this huge multi-volume, work, much like Proust, called The Study of History. But in one part of that, he talks about his inspiration for writing that. And one of the moments was this time when he was in Mistra, and he sat there overlooking the citadel, and suddenly it all came back to life for him. The battle was going on around him, and he saw everything happening. And then he talks about some other moments when that happened to him. He was in Rome. He was thrown back to some scene where there was some rebellion against, whatever the powers, and some important figure who was part of that was being hounded by the police, and he went to his own home, and his wife wouldn't let him in, and seeing that there was no hope there, he committed suicide, and so on and so on. All these vivid moments that he knew, he read about it, but somehow at these moments his imagination, or his imaginative grasp of the reality that he knew factually expanded, came to him. But the biggest one came when he was walking past a Victoria Station, and he said not only one or two different sort of moments of history came to him, but the whole kind of parade of history opened up before him in this kind of vast sort of kind of parade, so a better word for it. And he suddenly felt that he was up above time and space and be able to see. And again, it wasn't mystical in the sense of some other world or some other dimension, or it wasn't visionary in the sense of, say, an extraterrestrial or a religious figure came. It was a sort of knowledge he could ordinarily have, and did have, because he was a historian, but it became real. It wasn't just factual. It wasn't just dry information. The reality of it became real. And this ties back to the fact that we spend most of our time letting the robot do everything for us, and that's why we don't feel things are that real. We don't feel things are very, very real. And when we have these rare moments when they do feel real, we think, my God, what happened? This is some mystical visitation. And so Wilson takes this idea of Faculty X, and he runs with it, and he writes quite a few other books about the occult. As I said, he became a kind of very well-known figure. He hosted a TV show for a while called Leap in the Dark, that I think was, I don't think it was throughout the whole UK. I think it was sort of local, maybe Cornwall area. But he wrote much about it, and he wrote for magazines and newspapers about it. And I've got the two, there's sort of there's something you could call the occult trilogy. There's the occult mysteries, and this other book on the end here called Beyond the Occult. And my good friend and the Wilson bibliographer, Colin Stanley, he's written a book that kind of distills the different theories and ideas that Wilson runs through in those three. It calls it the occult trilogy. And one of the things that Wilson does is he reads everything. He reads everything that's around. I've tried to do that myself. He reads everything possible around, and then he tries to fit everything he's got from everything he's read together into a pattern. So he's a great synthesizer. He has his own ideas, and they run through, but he links many, many, many things together. So he's not sort of just sitting alone on his own saying, this is my idea, I don't care about everybody else. He's a voracious reader, and I think a very generous in this, because at least for me, and I think this is true of other readers of his, he lays out something that's the equivalent of an old liberal arts program, because if you follow up all the reading he's read, it will take you in many, many directions, and you will learn quite a bit. But there's some basic ideas that in Mysteries and Beyond the Occult that he talks about. And in Mysteries, this came out in 1978, he talks about something called the ladder of selves. And this is the idea that, we have this idea of here I am, this is me, and I don't vary that much. I may go up a little bit and go a little bit down, but actually he came to the understanding that our sense of self actually occupies a certain space on a kind of ladder of self, a kind of hierarchy of selves. And, we're more or less at the even keel, but we can go up to a higher kind of self, or we could be demoted in a way to a lower sort of self. And he came to this understanding because he himself went through a very bad period of panic attacks after the success of the occult, and he was in the spotlight again, and he was doing a lot of interviews and television shows, and he suddenly found that he was having these panic attacks every time that he was put in front of a camera, or asked to answer questions at an interview. And even worse, it was happening at home, like at night, and he's lying in bed, and he would wake up in the middle of night, and suddenly have this terrific sense of kind of sinking into this abyss. And well, what didn't help was that he was an inveterate workaholic, and he was asked to edit and also contribute to a series. It's something they called I think it was called a part book or something. It was something that each week came out. You know, it was a magazine. Each week came out with some articles, and at the end of whatever year, you could get them all bound together. It's kind of, Man, Myth, and Magic that was out in the 70s was something like that. And so it was something that was called Crime and Punishment. And I haven't touched on it in this talk, but Wilson also wrote quite a bit about crime. And so he was commissioned to, edit this series. And then the commissioning people kept asking him to step up the pace, and they wanted him to contribute more. And he was kind of asked to write like 10 3,000 word articles a week, which is like writing half a book a week. And as a working writer and a workaholic, like schedule wasn't as pounding as his. That's a heck of a lot of work. That's a heck of a lot to be asked to do. And he always said yes. He never said no to these things. And so he just found himself suddenly, he says, like one night he woke up about 3 a.m. and thought, Jesus, I should go down to my study and start work on the next article. And he said, no, if I do that, I'll come completely out of my mind. And then the punchline of all this is that he came to understand that he was in a struggle between a kind of childish, younger, more immature part of himself that basically said, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. You're working me too hard. I'm not going to do this. And a more mature part of himself said, look, you've agreed to this. You can't back out now. You need the money. You have to pay off the mortgage, all those kinds of things. But in the process of going through this kind of crisis, this kind of struggle with himself, he came to this understanding that our inner world is kind of made up of a kind of hierarchy, a ladder of selves. And the moments when he can kind of bring himself together, which language there even tells us something, he was in a scattered state where he was completely at the mercy of all of his fears and all that. But when he brought himself together, he felt that he somehow, momentarily at least, had, raised himself up another rung on the ladder. And he calls it the schoolmistress effect, where the schoolmistress in him was able to clap her hands, and all of the fears and anxieties and terrors kind of quieted for a while. But it took a while for him to do that. And it was through that he also became interested in the strange phenomena of multiple personality that he talks about at length in the book as well, where in himself he was in this tension between two parts of himself, but in characters like Sybil and others, that splits up into actual independent sort of beings. And this is it's still not really understood how that possibly can happen. And this is something that fascinated him in that book. And so this is like kind of one of the themes that he works throughout that book. But again, it's a book where he writes about everything in it. There's reincarnation, there's out-of-the-body experiences. One of the things that he does in the book is that he pays great homage to someone who's not read these days, a fellow named T.C. Lethbridge, who was a Cambridge archaeologist, but who spent the latter part of his life after he retired from Cambridge as a paranormal investigator, and did a great deal of work with pendulums and standing stones and megaliths and things like that. And Wilson spends the first kind of few chapters of the book talking about his work. And the other two books in the middle there, Poltergeist and Afterlife, I'm just going to name check them quickly, but he went on from the mystery of multiple personalities to studying the phenomenon of poltergeist, which is the kind of noisy ghost in the German. And it's not quite the same as that horrible movie some years ago, but things happen. Things shatter, things break, things fall off the shelves, puddles suddenly appear, and the more or less rational, scientifically accepted idea is that yes, somehow the unconscious mind of an adolescent, it's usually an adolescent, usually a girl who's just approaching puberty and going through all the biological changes and all that. There's a kind of energy that's there, doesn't have an outlet, and it's supposed to be projected out into the world and causes all these things. And Wilson was quite happy to accept that, but he said, after I studied all the cases, that didn't seem to cover all the bases. And he felt himself compelled to accept the idea of fellow he came to be friends with, Guy Lyon Playfair, who was a British writer who lived in South America and who studied the Spiritism there, which is like a major religion in Brazil, that actually, nope, they're real spirits. Somehow they're real spirits. The real spirits, they use the energy of the adolescents. They somehow use this kind of untapped psychic energy, but they're actually, it can't be explained in terms of just the unconscious mind. And this is a very eccentric view to take. And many other fellow paranormal investigators kind of cut Wilson off at that point, because he was saying, you're talking about spirits, man. We can't talk about that stuff. It's like, that's not scientific. This is sending us back, back into the Stone Age. And he's saying, well, I'm sorry, this is what all the evidence suggests to me. And likewise with Afterlife, again, I'm just giving you thumbnail sketches of these books. He investigated it. He came to the conclusion that there's sufficient evidence to suggest that, yes, in some form, there's survival of physical death. But he also felt that spiritualism doesn't really tell us anything about, he recounts one experience at the end of the book where he actually he went to quite a few, but he went to one seance and people actually invited him and told him this would be unlike anything else you've ever experienced and it would prove beyond doubt, all of that. And he went there and he said it couldn't stand up to the simplest kind of questions it would ask. And so he said he's absolutely convinced that there's survival of physical death, but that we don't learn anything really important about reality existence from anything that comes to us through these spiritual kind of seances, because he said the main thing is what's happening here. And fundamentally, he says, yes, there's these higher realms. There's these realms of more kind of spiritual reality. And yes, we have descended from them in some way. But the job is we've descended. The question is like, why are we here? If things are so much better in those other places, we're freer, we're more, participating in the spirit and all that, why are we sent back to this very dense, difficult world, one of the most difficult places in the universe, as Gurdjieff said. And in fact, Wilson just echoes in many ways what Madame Blavatsky said, is that this is the realm where anything can be achieved. We can't achieve anything in the other realms. Uspensky said at one point, you can't sculpt with a cloud. You can't, you need a solid kind of something at which you devote your power in order to change it, in order to make something out of it. The sculpture has to bang away at the stone in order to reveal the beauty within. And so he felt like, yes, he was convinced that there's, dimensions beyond life. We're not just annihilated when the brain stops working. But he felt like the beachheads, the action was here. And because he was an evolutionist in the sense that what's happening on this plane, he would say, is that whatever you want to call it, mind, spirit, freedom, it's slowly increasing its grasp on this world. It's slowly inserting a leak of freedom into the dense, resistant world of matter, which basically exists in order for us to be able to precisely do that. It's there for us to be able to, it's a resistant material against which we can best harness and direct our energies. And the other book on the end there, Beyond the Occult, again, this was another book he didn't want to write, but his publisher talked him into it because he felt he said everything he had to say, and I'm just barely touching the surface in his other books. But he decided, okay, I'll do it. And what he found was that he later claimed that this was his best nonfiction book, because he felt like he was able to draw together the existential concerns of his earlier work. He talks about this new existentialism, something that was not the kind of meaningless view of Sartre and Heidegger and all those, but an existentialism based on a vision of meaning, with the psychic and mystical kind of experiences. Because he felt there was a gradient. He thought there was a gradient between kind of like the psychic experience into kind of like the mystical experience into what Maslow called the peak experience, which are these sudden moments of joy and happiness that come to us unbidden out of the blue, and which Wilson understood in terms of non-robotic consciousness that come every now and then, that come in a spring morning. With any luck, maybe you might have one or two of them during this talk, I hope. But so he sees it as a gradient, the kind of psychic level of consciousness, the mystical level, this kind of aesthetic or poetic level. And all of these things are part of this general kind of map of consciousness that he's been working on. And the next sort of step. I don't, am I going? Do we have to have part 3, or no? Am I doing okay? It's 8 o'clock, right? This is a bit more. Okay.
Just unmuting myself really quick. I believe that you can carry on. Damon, do you want to nod ahead
Yeah. No,
there?
it's fine. That's
He's
fine.
giving
Good.
a
Okay.
thumbs
Okay.
up.
Okay.
Carry
I'm
on,
just.
Gary.
I'm out there.
Yeah,
I'm
you're good to go. Oh,
I'm faculty
Gary.
X. I'm faculty X in here. Okay. So one of the things that Wilson moved on to, I mean, it was a little bit out of chronology there, but this would have come up after Mysteries in 1978 and the early 80s, about 80, 81. He did a book called Frankenstein's Castle. And he became aware of this book that became very, very, very famous and well known in the late 70s by Julian Jaynes, called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And Jaynes was writing about the right and left brain, and other people had as well, Robert Ornstein, Robert Sperry. And Wilson says that he even sort of mentions it in Mysteries, but the importance of it, the significance of it, hadn't reached him yet. And it was only after a friend of his basically told him how important Jaynes' book was that he went back to it and read it and really said, yes, and now I see. And we know that the right and left brain thing, you know, there's a lot of it in the 80s into the 90s, and then it kind of lost, you know, its steam. And even scientists working on it decided there really wasn't much happening here, because it turned out that it wasn't quite the neat separation that we thought it was. But if you've been aware in the last 10 years or so, it's been rebooted through the work of Ian McGilchrist in a book called Master and His Emissary. And I've written about his work in some of my books. And if you know McGilchrist's book, and you know what Wilson was writing about the right and left brain back in the 80s, you can see that in many ways, and you know, larger, much more research, much more evidence in scientific terms provided, but he's actually saying quite a few of the same things that Wilson is saying. And Wilson came to see that this other mode of consciousness, this sort of mystical mode, or this faculty X mode, where the reality of things, and we have to remember, it's kind of reality in italics. You know, there's reality, and then there's reality, where you really, there's knowing, and then there's really knowing, in the sense that, you know, again, Proust knew that he spent his holidays in Cambrai with his aunt when he was a kid. If you asked him that, he said, oh yes, mais oui, mais certainement. But he didn't really know it until he tasted that Madeleine, because then it came back to him. The reality of it came back to him. So our whole life is like this. That's because we spend most of our time on the left side of our brain. And I said earlier that Wilson suspects that the paranormal phenomena, occult phenomena, come out of something that he called this lunar consciousness, this kind of earlier intuitive, more participatory form of consciousness that animals have and that early humans had, and then gradually we moved out of in order to develop our rational consciousness and develop science and so on and so on. That more or less meant a shift from this right brain dominant kind of consciousness over to the left brain. And again, this is something that I've talked about in my book, Lost Knowledge and Imagination, and I talk about it on that talk that's available on YouTube. And I said earlier about the axial age, and you can see the axial age is a shift from being sort of right brain dominant, meaning that at that point, say pre-500 BC, if you asked questions about the world, you were given a mythical answer. Oh, that's that way because this god did that. Or that's, you know, here's the story behind that. And what happened around 500 BC in Greece, where you get a fellow named Thales, who wasn't even a philosopher yet because we didn't have the word. We had to wait for Pythagoras to invent the word. He starts asking, what is this made of? He doesn't want to know the mythical story behind it. He doesn't want to know, you know, the narrative that explains why it is the way it is. He wants to know what's the fundamental stuff that it is made of. And that's everything that we call science begins there. Because the mythopoetic answer can't answer that. You know, oh, I don't know, the gods made it. You know, well, yeah, fine, that's great. I'm happy the gods made it. But what's it made of? I mean, we came to say he was made of matter, fine. And then what's matter? And then, okay, well, Thales is the one to say, well, it's all water. And all the early Greek, what they call the pre-Socratic, so Thales and Heraclitus and Anaxagoras and Anaximander, they all had a kind of answer to that. You know, Heraclitus was all fire, somebody else who was all air. And we can laugh at, you know, their answers now and how they tried to argue, but they had some actually quite cogent and convincing arguments, some of them. But they started asking those kind of questions, and those are left brain kind of questions. You can't answer those questions with a poem or a myth or a symbol. It's just factual. You want a factual answer. What time does the train arrive? Oh, when the west wind bloweth. And no, that's not going to tell me. Okay, when does the train turn up? Okay, that's basically those kind of questions. And we needed to ask those questions. That's how we're able to have this talk now and, you know, on the computer and everything. But in order to achieve that, we have to suppress this other intuitive, global, fuzzy. Okay, at the same time, we want that. That's why we discovered alcohol. That's why we discovered all these other inebriants that can put the left brain to sleep. Can also put the robot to sleep for a while. And you know, we start to experience the world in this direct, immediate, visceral kind of way that the right brain experiences it. The right brain has a fuzzy awareness of everything. I mean, all you have to do is watch the effect of yourself before and after you have a glass of wine. You could be sitting in your room, before the glass of wine, and you're just in your room, it's nothing special. Have the glass of wine, ooh, that's interesting. Something is suddenly interesting that wasn't interesting at all in the room. That's because you have dampened your left brain, which is just interested in what it needs to do in order to manipulate the world in order to get by. You put him on hold for a while, and this other information about the world that isn't practically necessary or utilitarianly valuable comes to you. You know, textures, colors, scents, you know, other dimensions of reality. And they're there all the time, but through evolutionary necessity, we have dampened that awareness of things. But at the same time, we also know that we want it intuitively. And what Wilson is saying is that, you know, it's the right brain basically that he feels is more or less behind the kind of mystical experiences we have, this kind of intuitive knowledge of things, the sort of strange knowledge that people we call idiot savants have, you know, who can't tie their shoelaces, but they can tell you what whether a 10-figure number is prime or not, you know. Or there's a famous story, who was it, of this young boy who asked his father once, when was he born? And he told him, and then he said, oh, in that case, I've lived, I forget how many millions of seconds, he said. And his father, okay, and went home, they worked it out, and he said, actually, you're wrong. And he said, no, you forgot to add the leap years. And so, but I mean, somehow that was the one thing that kid could do. I mean, he wasn't Einstein in that sense. So, but there's some way in which the left brain breaks everything down to bits and pieces. I mean, I've talked about this in other lectures, and if you want an easy way to understand, the left brain is a microscope, and the right brain is a panorama. Panorama is the big view, but you can't pick out all the details. Microscope zeroes in with laser accuracy, but it cuts out everything else. And we've favored, because we started out with the right brain. Animals have the right brain. Animals have the more global, fuzzy kind of background to things. We're successful insofar as we are in the world because we've been able to muzzle that kind of more global, intuitive fuzziness and focus on things, you know, in their immediacy. But it comes at a price. It comes at a price. And, you know, sadly, for most of Western intellectual history, we favored the kind of left brain thing because, you know, again, it's something we needed to do. It's not an evil, you know, villain. Although, McGilchrist's book, it's called The Master and His Emissary because he believes, and, you know, he's good evidence for it, and Wilson pre-echoes him, that the right brain is actually primary. And the right brain kind of invented the left brain because it needed somebody to unpack in detail the bigger picture that it presented. And then over time, the left brain took over. and the emissary took control over the master. And Wilson even says this himself in a book in 1980, and McGilchrist was saying it in, I think, 2009. But it's very much like William Blake intuitive this. If you know William Blake's poems, these fantastic mythopoetic epics that he wrote, he talks about your reason, taking over from Los, who's the spirit of imagination. And if you also know ancient Gnostic tradition, there's the whole idea of the demiurge taking over from the real God. The true God wants to create the world, but he doesn't dirty his hands with that kind of thing. And so he invents a demiurge who actually makes the world. He's given the commission to make the world. The demiurge says, look at this work I've done. This is pretty damn good. And he forgets about the true God commissioning him, and he begins to believe that he is the real God. And this is the same position that happens historically in our psychohistory with the left brain. The left brain was invented by the right brain in order to help us manipulate through the world, and then it did its job too well, and it began to believe that it was the master. And we've been living under that kind of idea for the last 400 years. And in many ways, I think we're reaping what we've sown in that sense. But I'm getting off on a tangent here. But okay, just to carry on a bit more with Wilson's career, he carried on writing about the right brain in a book called Access to Inner Worlds, in which he talks about meeting someone in Finland at a kind of spiritual center, alternative educational center, where he came to teach a class for a while. And this was someone that he actually felt was able to achieve this kind of union between the two sides. It's a fellow named Brad Absetz. And what happened to him was that, well, make a long story short, he found that during this time when he and his wife lost their first child, and his wife went into a deep depression, and there was nothing he could do for her, but he used to lie by her side when she was just lying out in a bed completely, out of her mind, in pain and suffering. And he was there waiting for her, any kind of sign from her that she was coming out of this. And so, he would be there for her. So he had to maintain a kind of difficult, condition of being relaxed, but also alert. And this led over time to him experiencing a strange phenomena where he felt like some other consciousness than his own ego, his own, familiar, I'm Brad, this is what I want to do, taking him over in some way. And at first he was a bit hesitant about this, but then he allowed it to happen. And more or less, what it turned out was that somehow his right brain had, because of this prolonged combination of alertness and relaxation lying by his wife, he had quieted his left brain down, which is usually, the left brain is saying, oh, let's go, let's get things done, let's get out there, let's run out there and take care of everything. But the right brain has no sense of time whatsoever. The right brain is always late. It exists in this kind of timeless, kind of sense, where the left is always, let's go and get things done. He had quieted that down. And somehow the right had, what do you want to say? It sort of, the roles were reversed, where the left is usually dominant, the right became dominant. And again, if you know anything about the history of right and left brain psychologies, many experiments happened, or operations where there's a knot of fibers called the corpus callosum that connects the two sides of the brain. And one of the ways to prevent epileptic fits is to slice this knot of fibers out, because an epileptic fit is a kind of electrical charge that goes from one side of the brain to the other. So they found if they did this, yes, the people were no longer susceptible to the fits. But they actually discovered that long story short, they turned into two people. There would be the usual sense of I, who lives in the left brain. So me talking to you now, I live in the left brain, because the left brain is language dominant. It's verbal, uses words. The right brain uses symbols and images and hunches and impressions and intuitions. It doesn't use words. And what happened was, when they sliced these poor people who needed this, or for other reasons, they had what's called the commissurotomy. They literally became two people, and they would find themselves where one of them would reach out for something at the market to buy, and the other hand would go like that, and it would grab something else. Or one of them would pick some jacket out of their wardrobe to put on, and the other hand would knock it away, and it would pick out something else. Or, one of them actually went to embrace their wife, and the other one pushed her away, which I guess, that tells you a lot about their relationship. And so this is like something that really, I'm not making this up. This actually happened. And so there's the you that you think of when you say I, me. That person lives in the left brain because you use language. You identify with language. You have to in order to say me, I, this is me. The other you doesn't use language. And what they found is that I'm throwing a lot of stuff together in one kind of big pile here. But one of the experiments found where if they showed with our eyes, it's split down the middle with the eyes as well. So the right brain controls the left visual field of each eye, and the left brain controls the right visual field of each eye. But what would happen is that they would show someone a picture of something that the right brain saw, right? That doesn't use language. And then they would ask that person to say what they had seen. And they couldn't say what they had seen. But asked to pick out on a paper with images of it, they could pick it out. Because that's an image. It's not a word. So one part of them didn't know what the other part saw. And there were even experiments or times where it happened where if the left brain was going to saying something and it gave the wrong answer, it would suddenly feel like something had kicked it under the table, like that. And they would say, no, that's wrong. And then it would say the other thing, which the right brain was sort of, doing that. It had a, either or kind of choice. And we experience this ourselves if, the phenomena of having something on the tip of your tongue. You know it, but somehow you can't say it because your right brain knows it. Your left brain has forgotten. The right brain is making you feel like you know it. And it'll try to, and one thing I would say, when the next time you feel that, try to remember what images are going on in your head. Because your right brain may very well be sending images up into you that could be a reminder of the actual name that you want to remember. Or a song going through your head. One of the phenomena I've found, and just paying attention to what goes on in my head, is that I've often found myself with a song going through my head that was very appropriate for some situation I was in or about to be in. And I didn't decide to hum it. It just started there. And me, verbal Gary, didn't decide to do that, but me, nonverbal, other Gary, said, here's a song that's very appropriate for what you're about to do, because the right brain is tuned to music, whereas the left brain remembers the lyrics, but the right brain remembers the tune. So in any case, the same kinds of ideas he started to apply to other wide range of things. And I didn't talk much about his criminal interest in crime and all that, but he wrote this massive book in the early 80s called The Criminal History of Mankind, which is a fantastic read. It's just for the history. And I mean, all of his books are page turners. There's not a dull moment on any of his books. And in this one, he fundamentally says that crime more or less starts with the rise of left brain dominance, because the left brain is always looking for the easiest way to achieve its ends. It's always looking for the shortcut to get to something. And he even this is one place in which he brings in this book called The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, because what Julian Jaynes says is that, back around, say, 1500, BC, human beings didn't have an interior world in the same way that we do. We can think to ourselves, what do I want to do? Gee, do I want to listen to the rest of this lecture? God, whatever, we can think to ourselves something and come to some decision. He's saying people at that time didn't have that facility. They didn't have an interior world where they can retreat into and converse with themselves. What they did have was that they would hear voices in their head. They thought they were the gods or spirits or something like that. He says there were voices coming from their right brain. auditory hallucinations. And he came to this conclusion because he himself experienced some auditory hallucinations. And any of us, we can experience them as well. If you pay attention as you fall asleep, you go through a stage which is known as the hypnagogic stage, which basically means descent into sleep. And it's a state in between sleep and waking. And you see images, weird kind of designs, but you can often sometimes hear voices. I often hear somebody say my name as I'm falling asleep or something, or hear some weird sentence or something like that. And so James himself experienced this. And I mean, he was sort of materialist sort of scientist, so he didn't take any kind of spiritual or philosophical kind of value out of this. But he did come to this conclusion that sometime around 1200 BC, there was this kind of catastrophic events happened in the Mediterranean, volcanic eruptions and invasions by people called the Sea People. And what had happened is that humans then were more placid, were more peaceful, and would just kind of wait for the gods to tell them what to do. But all this stuff going on, this crisis around them, they weren't able to exist in that way. And to put it simply, he said, the peasant who saw his wife being raped by some invader, who would have just gone to save her, if he was able to say, "Oh God, if I do that, they'll probably cut me down too," he was able to retreat into himself. And it's a gruesome example. This one James gives. It's sort of like the ability to be able to retreat into oneself was something that became adaptive. It was for survival. And this is the beginning of what we experience now, this interior kind of world. But he says this was the breakdown of the bicameral. Bicameral means two-chambered. So it just means the two sides of the brain. And what he's saying is that at that point in our history, we didn't have this kind of clear communication between the two sides that we have now. And we can debate that kind of theory. But what Wilson noticed was that historically, something that we recognize as cruelty and violence for its own sake starts to become more and more prominent around the same time as Jane says this kind of breakdown of the bicameral mind starts. So the cozy, more intuitive, pre-patriarchal, kind of consciousness, which there was less, it was violence, but there wasn't violence for its own sake, which is cruelty. There's violence, and then there's violence for its own sake. There's violence as a show of power. And what you get is you get these kings starting to list all of the, inhabitants of the city that they killed, and how many heads they had sticking on the posts, and all that kind of thing, which historically you don't get. And Wilson says this: we can understand this as the rise of a left brain dominance, in the sense that the left brain will brook no resistance to its desires. It will go for the shortcut, the easiest way to do something. And smash and grab and take and kill is the easiest sort of thing. And it also develops frustration. The right brain doesn't get frustrated. The right brain can sit and look out the window and look at the rain falling in a puddle for hours. And I like doing that myself occasionally. But the left brain gets very frustrated. It wants to do something. And if there's anything in its way, it will attack that. So this is, again, a way in which he understands the origin and source, and I'm giving a very brief sketch of this, of violence for its own sake in human history. And in the other book, The Misfits, this is where Wilson wasn't interested in drugs, although he did write a book about wine. But his ecstatic agent of choice was sex. And again, he wasn't promiscuous. He was, once he married Joy Wilson, who's his widow, who survives today, he remained, loyal to her and all that, but he wrote quite a lot about sex. And he was fascinated with, he said sort of, again, this may seem a bit counterintuitive, but the easiest way I can describe how he understood how important sex was, he says, masturbation is the only kind of, how should we say it? If you're hungry and you imagine a steak, you can't eat it. If you're thirsty and you imagine a cold glass of beer, you can't drink it. But if you are, you feel sexual desire, you can imagine a sexual object and bring yourself to satisfaction. Now, it's not a moral issue. We're able to do that. In some way, in sex, an imaginative object can fulfill the same function as, the actual thing. It can't do that with food. It can't do that with drink. So somehow he's saying sex in some way is related to our powers of imagination. And he doesn't necessarily mean fantasizing in some kind of weird thing. In fact, that's what that book is about. That book is to show that the notion that we can spice up our sex life by having all these strange fantasies or strange transgressions. He says this is actually, this is subject to the law of diminishing returns, because what you wind up doing, much like a drug addict, is you have to increase the dose to get the same effect. And so the Henry Millers who pursue a life of sexual conquest, or the Casanovas, or the Desads, who actually don't do the things, they just write about them in their book where they're in jail, in a cell, and that's where he wrote all these books like 120 Days of Sodom and Justine and all that. He never did any of the things that he wrote about. I mean, the only thing Desad do actually, he sliced one prostitute once, just a little nick. She got really, and then he gave one what they call Spanish fly, which was a aphrodisiac, and then that got him in trouble, and he got arrested for that. But all the things, we have a word called sadism for Desad. He imagined all these things while he was in jail, in order to stop himself from going insane, basically, and also to express his great resentment at society. And so you have him, but yet all you have to do is read a few pages of 120 Days of Sodom to get the notion that this whole notion of transgression is self-defeating. Because in the first place, it has to posit the conventional world that it rejects in order to have any effect. Right? Because if you don't have the conventional world that you're transgressing, that your transgression, doesn't mean anything. And then two, after you've shot the 20th nun out of a cannon, it's like, well, what do we do next? So I'm exaggerating to make a point, but all you have to do is page through a few pages of 120 Days of Sodom, and you see I'm not pushing it too much. So what Wilson is saying is like, what all these sort of sexual transgressors are really trying to achieve is not some kind of ultimate sexual experience. What they want is to increase their grasp on reality. And what happens, precisely because they have a very slim grasp on reality, they have to add these spices to it in order to, increase, to make it real to themselves. So this is the same kind of problem that he dealt with in his early existential books, about the fact that we don't feel real. We don't have a real sense of our being. And one of the times when we do is during sex, is the eruption of power and ecstasy in the sexual orgasm. We momentarily feel, I can only speak for myself, and I'm not exaggerating, but momentarily feel some kind of, orgasmic power, and, you feel on top of, wow. And then, what the Henry Millers, they think that's what they want, but what they don't really want the conquest. They want the sense of themselves as being an active agent in the world that the conquest gives to them. They want the sense of reality that another seduction gives to them, and so they waste their lives in seduction rather than understanding, oh, actually, it's this kind of intensification of consciousness that I'm actually looking for. So so just to just get through the next stuff as quickly as I can. This is Wilson in his later life. By the 1990s, he became very interested in the whole notion of Atlantis and ancient Egypt. He became aware of the work of Graham Hancock, who's very well known, who's written many books about all this. The fellow above Hancock with the mustache and turned, looking over his shoulder, is Schwaller de Lubitsch, who was a French esoteric philosopher from the early 20th century. But he's the one who but he's one of the ones to suggest that the Sphinx was much older than the accepted time for it. And this is because he said the erosion marks on it were made from water, not from the wind and sand. And this was something that, if you know the whole story with Hancock and Robert Bauval and John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, who was the geologist who finally went and looked at the Sphinx, and he said, yes, the erosion marks here are not made by wind, or not made by sand hitting the stone, they're made by water. And this led to this whole controversy where, Egyptologists were scandalized. They were saying, no, it was built in 2500 BC, and the most conservative estimate from Schwalder-Lubitsch's insights and Schoch's geological investigation was that it was more like 7,000 or like that. So it's still much older than the accepted thing. And this led to a whole notion of like, well, also, where did they get the technology to build these things? I mean, I can't go through all the evidence for it, but if you know this whole story, there are many, many, many things that came out of the study of Egypt, that suggests that they somehow had access to a technology that the conventional view of ancient history does not allow them to have. I forget what they actually called. There are these long kind of vases that have this very long, thin neck, and a kind of a bowl at the bottom, and they're made of some material that, in order to achieve the kind of precise sculpting out of the interior of this thing, it's nothing that they would have had available at the time was that we know of could have been able to do this. And of course, we've heard lots of this stuff in a pop version with people like Eric von Däniken and things like that. But Wilson based a lot of his ideas about what he came to believe to be evidence for a global kind of maritime civilization on the work of an American historian named Charles Hapgood. I can't go into great detail about that, but he studied these famous maps, the Piri-Reis maps. And these are maps that are in the Library of Congress in America that seem to show Antarctica free of ice. And they seem to show sort of contours of the shoreline and river inlets that have been made known through sort of sonar readings or something like that. So someone like Eric von Däniken in the famous book Chariots of the Gods, he talks about these as well. And he jumped to the conclusion, well, ancient astronauts must have flown over, the planet and, passed on this knowledge to, us in some way, and we have it now. And Hapgood saying, well, we don't necessarily have to invite the aliens to come and do this, because he makes a good argument that there's evidence for a vast global maritime civilization, meaning that they would have been traveling around. But the last time Antarctica wasn't covered with ice was quite some time ago. So, and also there's shifts on the planet's surface as well, where the continents move in different places. So, but again, for Wilson, what's really important about all this is fundamentally, for him, the kind of consciousness the Egyptians might have had, or whoever built the Sphinx might have had. For he sees it as one in which that kind of immediate knowledge that I mentioned the idiot savants having. Or he tells a story about Robert Graves, the poet Robert Graves, to whom he dedicated the occult, because he was writing it when he met Graves, and he was on the island of Majorca. One of the last books he did is called Superconsciousness, and it's kind of a DIY book for him. Although he didn't really write books like, do these disciplines, do these exercises kind of thing. For him, it's more about understanding the ideas about consciousness he's putting across, because once you absorb those ideas, then you can see how you can apply them in many ways. But he tells one story when he was snowed in at a place where he was giving a lecture somewhere down in Devon. And this was, again, some years ago. And it took hours and hours and hours for him to just get his car out of the place, the farmhouse where it was parked, and he got onto one of the roads. And if you know any of the roads down in that part of England, they're these tiny boroughs. They're not big American roads. They're like really, really tiny kind of roads, and there's ditches on either side of them. So long story short, he was able to get onto these roads. It was still kind of snowed in, And he had to drive very, very slowly, and at the same time keeping very alert to make sure that he didn't turn and fall into one of the ditches, because the snow was straight across. He couldn't see where the ditch was and where it wasn't. And he had to do that for hours. So he finally got, he's got like at 5 miles an hour or something like that. So he finally got to one of the main roads. And what he found is when he got to the main road and he kind of went like that, had this experience where everything kind of expanded around him. This was experience he had when he was a young man as well, where he felt like his consciousness stretched out all around him. And so it expanded beyond the immediate moment of himself. And this led him to this insight that if you maintain a kind of steady concentration, not a sudden kind of like that, like Graham Greene would have felt when he put the gun to his head, but a kind of steady focus on something and really keep your mind on it, for a good amount of time. When you finally relax, you have sort of pushed yourself up a bit. What he says, you're no longer 51% robot and 49% you, you're 51% you and 49% robot. And that sense of everything suddenly coming alive and having radiating kind of meaning is a result of you, literally in his case, getting into the driver's seat. And he tells the story of the Zen monk Ikkyu, who was asked by one of his disciples, could you please give us some direction in what we should do in order to reach enlightenment? And Ikkyu wrote attention. And the disciple said, well, that's nice. That's very good. But could you possibly see yourself to give us a little bit more? And he wrote attention. And then he said, come on, can you just open that up a little bit more? And he wrote attention. So again, it sounds, we've heard this before, but what Wilson is basically saying, and I've only been able to touch on this in this talk, was that but it goes back to this thing, when the gun's to your head, you go like this, and suddenly being alive you want it more than anything else. Even the most boring thing become suddenly radiant with meanings you didn't understand. But we can achieve that without putting a gun to our head, and in less dramatic measures, by this kind of what he learned from the experience of him having to drive through the snow very, very slowly, with his mind focused on not going into the ditch. And when he finally got to the main road, he was able to relax, and he had pushed himself up into this other level. So sorry for going on and on, but we can call it an evening there. Thank you very much.
You again, if those of you who are watching, the books that Gary has written, you can follow him on Twitter, but the book that he has written, if you want to learn more about Colin Wilson, is Beyond the Robot, The Life and Work of Colin Wilson. There it is. Thank you very much. Good timing. Gary actually has met Colin, and you can find the first half of this lecture online, this one will also be up online. There you go. Let's ask to unmute. Let's let you close. Again, thank you to the Blavatsky Trust for putting this on, along with the Theosophical Society in England. The headquarters has hosted this, and we are so grateful for all of you. Again, thank you coming in from everybody. Gary Lachman, thank you very much for a fantastic Sunday evening.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.